She's 70 years old, and you need to grasp that before anything else makes sense. 70 in an age when most people never saw their 40th year. This woman has endured plagues that wiped out entire cities, wars that tore kingdoms apart, assassinations that left thrones soaked in blood, and watched nearly everyone she ever loved die violently. She's ruled kingdoms with an iron will, commanded armies across battlefields, and outlived every enemy who ever stood against her, except for one. And right now, in this moment, she stands completely naked before a roaring crowd of thousands. Soldiers with blood on their hands, peasants hungry for spectacle, nobles drunk on power, priests who claim to serve God, all of them watching her exposed body, all of them laughing at her humiliation, all of them waiting to see exactly how the 70-year-old woman is going to die. The year is 613, and the place is a desolate field just outside the city walls of Rennes, in what we now call eastern France. The woman trembling in chains, stripped of everything including her dignity, is Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, one of the most formidable rulers European history has ever known. For nearly half a century, she shaped the destiny of an entire continent, her influence reaching into every corner of the fractured kingdoms that rose from Rome's ashes. What her captors are about to do to her will stretch across 3 agonizing days. 3 days of calculated, systematic humiliation designed not merely to end her life, but to obliterate everything she represented, everything she built, everything she dared to be. 3 days that medieval chroniclers documented in meticulous, horrifying detail because they wanted every generation that followed to witness what happens when a woman accumulates too much power, when she refuses to bow, when she threatens a natural order that men have convinced themselves is divine. But here's what those chroniclers won't tell you, what you absolutely must understand before we go any further. Brunhilde wasn't a villain spawned from some medieval nightmare. She wasn't the monster that centuries of propaganda have painted her to be. Those crimes or enemies attributed to her, those dark conspiracies and ruthless murders they whispered about in candlelit halls, most of them were fabricated after her death, manufactured specifically to justify the unspeakable horror of her execution. The true story buried beneath layers of lies and historical distortion is infinitely more complicated, heartbreakingly tragic, and disturbingly relevant to the world we live in today. What happened to Brunhilde wasn't justice served cold. It was revenge served with theatrical cruelty. It was a blood-soaked final act of a feud that had consumed 2 royal families for 46 years, leaving trails of corpses and shattered dynasties in its wake. This was what happens when powerful men, threatened by a woman's refusal to disappear quietly into history, decide she's lived too long, accumulated too much influence, and needs to be transformed into a warning for any woman who might dare follow in her footsteps. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments and hit that subscribe button to Sinister Empires, because you're not going to want to miss where this story goes next. The method they chose to make their example of her, the deliberate degradation they orchestrated, is something that has haunted me since the moment I first uncovered the details in those ancient texts. Stay with me through this journey because I'm going to reveal the complete story, not just a nightmare of her final hours, but the remarkable woman she was before that field, the kingdom she built with strategic brilliance, the power she wielded with calculated precision, the loved one she lost to betrayal and violence, and why her execution is designed those final 3 days to be the most degrading public spectacle that 6th century Europe had ever witnessed. This is the story of Queen Brunhilde, a woman history tried to erase by drowning her memory in manufactured infamy. Let me transport you back to where it all began, because understanding Brunhilde is horrific and requires knowing exactly who she was at the start, before power and tragedy transformed her. She entered this world around 543 in the Visigothic kingdom, a realm sprawling across most of modern Spain and the sun-drenched territories of southern France. Her father, King Athanagild, ruled with the authority that automatically made her royalty from her first breath. But being a princess in the brutal 6th century bore no resemblance to the fairy tales we tell children today. There were no glass slippers or magical transformations, only cold political reality. You were a valuable asset, a bargaining chip to be traded to whichever alliance would bring your family the greatest strategic advantage. And your desires, your dreams, your very humanity mattered less than the treaty your marriage could secure. When Brunhilde reached approximately 23 years old, her father arranged her marriage to Sigebert I, the king of Austrasia. Austrasia stood as one of the powerful Frankish kingdoms that had emerged like phoenixes from the smoking ruins of the collapsed Roman Empire, its territories covering roughly what we now recognize as northeastern France, Belgium, and the western reaches of Germany. It was a kingdom overflowing with wealth from trade routes, strengthened by military might, and Sigebert carried a reputation as an advantageous match for any princess. But here's the crucial first thing you must understand about Brunhilde that separates her from every other royal bride of her era. She wasn't merely beautiful in the way chroniclers lazily describe princesses. She was intellectually brilliant in ways that threatened the established order. Historical records describe her as exceptionally educated far beyond the standards of her time, fluent in multiple languages when most nobles struggle with one, and deeply versed in the complexities of Roman law and administrative systems that had governed empires. In an age when the majority of royalty, including kings, could barely scratch out their own names, Brunhilde was a genuine scholar, and she was about to step into a violent world that had absolutely no framework for understanding or accepting a woman with her capabilities. She married Sigebert in 567, and according to multiple historical accounts, something unexpected happened. It became a genuine love match, not just another cold political transaction between kingdoms. Sigebert was reportedly completely captivated by both her sharp intelligence and her striking beauty, a combination that proved irresistible. They had children together who carried both their bloodlines. They ruled side by side as partners rather than king and subordinate, and for one brief, shining moment before everything shattered, Brunhilde possessed everything a woman of her time could hope for. And then, without warning, her sister was brutally murdered, and everything Brunhilde thought she understood about power and safety crumbled into dust. Brunhilde's younger sister Galswitha had been married off to Sigebert's brother, King Chilperic of Neustria, in what was supposed to be another strategically advantageous match, another carefully constructed alliance designed to strengthen bonds between kingdoms and prevent the wars that constantly threatened to erupt. But Chilperic kept a mistress, a former servant who had clawed her way up from nothing named Fredegund, and Fredegund absolutely refused to be cast aside for some foreign princess who thought her noble blood made her special. Within a single year of that wedding, Galswitha was discovered strangled in her own bed, her lifeless body testament to how dangerous it was to stand between Fredegund and power. Everyone knew exactly who was responsible for murder. The whisper spread through every hall and tavern. Fredegund made virtually no effort to conceal her involvement, and Chilperic, rather than punishing his mistress for the assassination of his wife, married Fredegund instead, elevated her queen, and rewarded her for murdering Brunhilde's sister right under his royal roof. Make sure you like this video and share it with anyone who loves untold history, and comment below about what you think drove these people to such darkness, because this is only the beginning of a 46-year blood feud that will leave kingdoms drowning in violence. I need you to truly imagine what that moment must have felt like. Let it sink into your bones. Your baby sister, sent away to a foreign kingdom to marry a man who seemed like a suitable match, but revealed himself as a monster, murdered in her own bed by a former servant who craved her crown. And the man responsible, the husband who should have demanded justice, faced absolutely no consequences. Instead, he elevated that murderer to royalty, placed a crown on her head, and made her his queen as if your sister's life meant nothing at all. This is a precise moment where the blood feud ignited, the wound that would fester and spread poison for nearly half a century. This is where everything that followed became inevitable. For the next 46 years, Brunhilde and Fredegund would be locked in a war that consumed everything in its path, devouring their families whole, tearing their kingdoms apart, and ultimately destroying their lives in ways neither could have imagined when this nightmare began. I need to tell you something critical about Fredegund before we venture any deeper into this darkness, because understanding who she was is absolutely essential to comprehending what eventually happened to Brunhilde in that field. Fredegund embodied everything Brunhilde was not, her perfect dark mirror. Where Brunhilde carried the education and refinement of noble birth, Fredegund had clawed her way up from absolute nothing through calculated manipulation, strategic seduction, and casual murder. Where Brunhilde operated through the established channels of law and administrative systems inherited from Rome, Fredegund operated through poison slipped into wine cups and assassins dispatched in the dead of night. The chroniclers of that blood-soaked era described Fredegund as perhaps the most ruthless woman in all of Frankish history, a woman who ordered the deaths of bishops without hesitation, had nobles murdered when they questioned her authority, and even eliminated members of her own family when they became inconvenient obstacles to her ambitions. These two women hated each other with an intensity that defies our modern understanding, a hatred so pure and consuming it could power kingdoms into war. This wasn't some polite political rivalry conducted with diplomatic letters and strategic marriages. This was deeply, violently personal. This was blood screaming for blood across decades. And for nearly 5 decades, that burning hatred between two queens would shape the entire destiny of Western Europe, determining which kingdoms rose and which fell, who lived and who died in the constant warfare that followed. But here's the crucial truth you need to understand before you accept the historical narrative at face value. When those medieval chroniclers sat down to record these events for posterity, they were almost universally men who served in the courts of the kings who eventually triumphed, men who had every possible reason to portray Brunhilde as a scheming villain and Fredegund as merely a loyal wife defending her husband's interests against foreign threats. The narrative that survived the centuries and came down to us is a narrative deliberately written by the very people who orchestrated Brunhilde's destruction, and we need to read every word of it with that uncomfortable understanding coloring our interpretation. Because the Brunhilde who emerges from a more neutral sources, the administrative records that documented daily governance, the legal documents that bore her seal, the building inscriptions that credit her patronage, is dramatically different from the monster her enemies spent decades painting for history. That Brunhilde was a builder who maintained civilization, while chaos threatened at every border. She was a reformer who understood that kingdoms needed more than swords to survive. She was a ruler who maintained the ancient Roman roads when others let them crumble, who kept the aqueducts flowing when easier options would have been to let infrastructure decay. She patronized churches and monasteries, understanding that faith and learning needed protection in those brutal times. She tried desperately to bring order and the remnants of Roman civilization to kingdoms that were sliding inexorably into the chaos and barbarism that would define the coming Dark Ages. That Brunhilde was a woman who did exactly what she had to do to survive in a world that gave women almost no legitimate power, and who used whatever power she could grasp to accomplish things that, had she been a man, would have made her celebrated as a great king throughout history. But that's not the Brunhilde that history ultimately chose to remember and teach to future generations. History deliberately chose to remember and preserve the twisted version her enemies created to justify their actions. And what they did to her in those final 3 days was carefully designed to ensure that their manufactured version would be the only one anyone would ever know, the only story that would survive. The wars between Brunhilde and Fredegund stretched across decades like an open wound that refused to heal. Battles were fought across muddy fields and burned villages. Territories changed hands with each season's campaigning. Children and grandchildren were systematically drawn into a conflict that had ignited before most of them were even born, inheriting hatreds they didn't create. Brunhilde's husband Sigebert was assassinated in 575, cut down by agents sent by Fredegund, his blood payment for supporting his wife's demand for justice. Brunhilde was captured briefly in the chaos that followed, but she managed a daring escape that would have made her a legend had she been a man. She remarried, seeking protection and alliance, was widowed again by violence, and eventually claimed the position of regent for her son Childebert II, stepping into power not as a decorative figure, but as true ruler. This is where Brunhilde revealed what she was genuinely capable of when given the authority to act. As regent, she refused to simply hold power and trust until her son came of age like women were expected to do. She wielded that power with both hands. She formed strategic alliances with distant kingdoms. She reformed the entire administration of her realm, streamlining systems that had grown corrupt and inefficient. She built infrastructure that would serve her people for generations. She maintained the sophisticated postal system the Romans had created, understanding that communication held kingdoms together. She patronized the church strategically and used its growing influence to extend her own power across territories. She accomplished everything that any capable king would have done, and in many documented cases, she did it significantly better than the men around her. The problem that would ultimately destroy her was brutally simple. She was not a king. She was a queen, and queen regents were supposed to gracefully step aside when their sons grew up and claimed their birthright. Brunhilde did not step aside. Even after Childeber came of age and could rule in his own right, even after he married and fathered children of his own who would continue the dynasty, Brunhilde remained the dominant force in Austrasian politics, the power behind and sometimes in front of the throne. When Childeber died unexpectedly in 596, Brunhilde became regent yet again, this time for her grandson Studebert and Theoderic. 2 kings now, 2 separate kingdoms, and one grandmother controlling both with an iron will. This was absolutely unprecedented in Frankish history. This was dangerous to every established power structure. And this was the moment when the nobility of Austrasia and Burgundy began to truly fear what she represented. You have to understand the reality of Frankish politics to grasp why she terrified them. The Frankish nobility possessed power specifically because the kings had historically been weak and divided. They had carved out their own territories over generations, established their own privileges and exemptions, created their own semi-independent domains where they ruled like petty kings. A strong, centralizing monarch threatened absolutely everything they had built. And Brunhilde was not just a strong monarch. She was a dangerously intelligent one who understood Roman law and how it could be used to centralize authority. One who grasped administration in ways that could actually succeed in destroying their cherished autonomy forever. They could not simply depose her through force or open rebellion. She had carefully cultivated the loyalty of the church hierarchy. She had earned the genuine loyalty of much of the common people who benefited from her roads and her justice. She had decades of hard-won experience and a sophisticated network of alliances that made her extremely dangerous to challenge directly. So they did what threatened men always do when they cannot defeat their enemy openly. They waited for their moment. They plotted in shadows. They spread vicious rumors about her through every hall and marketplace. They whispered through every corridor and marketplace that she was personally responsible for every death that occurred, every misfortune that struck the kingdom, every military setback that befell their armies. They called her a witch who practiced dark arts in hidden chambers. They called her a cold-blooded murderer who eliminated anyone who stood in her path. They called her things so vile I cannot repeat them here, though I'm sure you can imagine the accusations men hurl at powerful women they want to destroy. And through it all, they waited patiently for their opportunity to strike, like wolves circling wounded prey. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Fredegund died. In 597, Brunhilde's great enemy, the woman who had murdered her sister and launched this decades-long blood feud, finally passed away, apparently of natural causes, after all those years of plotting and poisoning. After 46 years of constant warfare, political maneuvering, and mutual destruction, Brunhilde had accomplished what must have seemed impossible. She had outlived her greatest enemy. But Fredegund had left behind a son, Clothar II, and that young man had inherited not just his mother's kingdom of Neustria, but every drop of her burning hatred. The blood feud was far from over. It had simply passed like a cursed inheritance to the next generation, and this new enemy would prove even more dangerous than his mother. Clothar was patient in ways Fredegund had never been. He was cunning and willing to wait for the perfect moment. And he understood something that Brunhilde, for all her political brilliance, perhaps did not fully appreciate until it was too late. The Austrasian nobility didn't just dislike her or resent her reforms. They genuinely feared her, feared what she represented, feared what she might accomplish if given enough time. And fear, properly manipulated, can be turned into decisive action if you offer threatened people right incentives, the right promises of restored power. In 613, the trap that had been years in the making was finally sprung. Brunhilde's own nobles, the men she had ruled for decades, betrayed her completely. They sent secret messages inviting Clothar to invade their kingdom. They opened their fortress gates to his armies without resistance. They handed over their queen, the woman who had governed them, built roads for them, administered justice for them, directly into the hands of her greatest enemy. She was 70 years old at that moment. She had survived absolutely everything the brutal 6th century had thrown at her. She had outlived multiple husbands, watched her children die, mourned grandchildren. She had navigated the most treacherous political landscape in all of Europe for nearly half a century with remarkable skill. And now she found herself in the complete power of a man whose mother she had been at war with for his entire life. A man who had spent his childhood and youth listening to endless stories about how Brunhilde had murdered his relatives, systematically destroyed his family, brought nothing but ruin to his people. A man who wanted revenge not just for himself, but for a mother who had died still hating Brunhilde with her final breath. What happened next would become the most notorious execution in all of early medieval history, a cautionary tale whispered for centuries. I need to prepare you for what I'm about to describe because the specific details of what was done to Brunhilde are genuinely disturbing. They were deliberately meant to be disturbing. The entire point of this public spectacle was to create such extreme suffering that no woman would ever again dare to accumulate the kind of power and influence that Brunhilde had held over kingdoms. The torture lasted 3 full days. 3 days during which Brunhilde was subjected to every conceivable humiliation that Clothar and his advisors could devise in their darkest imaginations. And the historical records are absolutely clear that this was not random cruelty or spontaneous violence. Every single element was chosen deliberately, planned carefully, to maximize her complete degradation in front of as many witnesses as possible. On the first day, they stripped her, a 70-year-old woman, a queen who had worn the finest garments that European craftsmen could create, who had received foreign ambassadors in halls draped with silk, who had commanded armies with a word, was stripped completely naked in front of the assembled crowd. Her royal clothes were torn violently from her body, while soldiers held her firmly in place to prevent resistance, and then she was forced to stand there, entirely exposed, while thousands of people looked and pointed and laughed at her aged body. This was not just cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was carefully orchestrated theater, designed to send a message. In the 6th century, a queen's body was supposed to be sacred, hidden from common eyes, covered in rich fabrics and jewelry that signified her elevated status and divine right to rule. To expose that body was to strip away everything she represented as a ruler, to force people to see her not as their queen, but as just flesh, old flesh, vulnerable flesh, human flesh like their own. The sources describe her standing with whatever dignity she could still manage, while the crowd jeered mercilessly. They threw rotting food at her, garbage, filth. They shouted the vilest insults they could conceive. And she stood there, because what else could she possibly do in that moment? On the second day, they paraded her through the countryside. They placed her on a camel, not a horse which would have carried some measure of dignity. A camel, in Frankish territory. Camels were exotic animals, foreign, associated with the strange peoples of the distant East. Putting Brunhilde on a camel was a deliberate way of saying she was not really one of them. She never had been. She was other. She was foreign. She was a Visigothic outsider who presumed to rule Frankish kingdoms for 50 years. They led the camels slowly through massive crowds of people, through villages and towns, through the very places where Brunhilde had once been greeted with elaborate ceremony and genuine reverence. Now she was paraded as a captured enemy, still completely naked, still utterly exposed, mounted on an animal specifically chosen to make her look ridiculous. The chronicles describe people traveling for miles around to witness the spectacle, to see the great queen brought low, to see this woman who had terrified their lord for decades reduced to a naked old woman on a camel. And through all of this horror, she remained alive. She was fully conscious. She knew exactly what was happening to her. She felt every agonizing moment of it. I cannot begin to imagine what those 2 days were like for her. What thoughts went through her mind as she endured this nightmare? The physical suffering would have been immense beyond description. No food or very little food, no water or barely enough to survive, exposed to the elements without protection. 70 years old and subjected to treatment that would break a young person in peak health. But the psychological suffering must have been infinitely worse than any physical pain. Every face in those jeering crowds was someone who knew exactly who she was. Many of them had served in her administration. Many of them had directly benefited from her rule, traveled her roads, received her justice. And now they were laughing at her naked body, throwing garbage at her, shouting obscenities, competing to see who could be cruelest. Everything she had built over 50 years, everything she had accomplished against impossible odds, everything she had survived through pure will and intelligence, none of it mattered now in this field. She was just a spectacle now, stripped of everything that had defined her for 70 years. An object lesson for future generations, a warning carved in humiliation and pain. And she still had one more day to endure before this nightmare would end. On the third day, they finally killed her, but not quickly, not mercifully, not with any shred of the dignity that even common criminals were sometimes granted. The execution method that Clothart chose was specifically designed to ensure that Brunhilde's death would be as prolonged, as agonizing, and as degrading as her final days had already been. They tied her to a horse, but not placed upon it like a rider. They tied her to it like cargo, like an object to be dragged. The historical accounts differ on exactly how this binding was accomplished. Some sources claim her long hair was tied cruelly to the horse's tail. Some say her arms and legs were bound separately to 4 different horses in preparation for being torn apart. The most common and detailed account describes that she was tied by one arm, one leg, and her hair to tail a wild, unbroken horse that had been specifically chosen for its temperament. And then, with the crowd watching in anticipation, they released the horse into the open field. I'm not going to describe what happened next in graphic detail, because your imagination can fill in the horror. A wild horse, terrified by the noise and the weight, bolting in panic across the field, dragging a 70-year-old woman's body behind it across the rough ground. The impact of stones and earth, the tearing of flesh, the gradual, systematic destruction of a human body as it was pulled at speed across terrain that showed no mercy. The sources are clear that it took time. They explicitly state she did not die immediately or quickly. They record that the horse ran and ran, while Brunhilde was still alive, still conscious, still feeling absolutely everything that was happening to her body. And then when it was finally over, when the horse had tired from its run and Brunhilde's body was no longer recognizable as human, when there was nothing left but broken flesh and scattered bones, they burned what remained. There would be no tomb for Brunhilde, no elaborate monument, no sacred place where people would come to remember her reign or honor her accomplishments. The message being sent was brutally clear. This woman was to be erased from history itself, not just killed, but obliterated, removed from existence so thoroughly that nothing would remain except the memory of her suffering, the story of her punishment. That was the entire point of this 3-day spectacle. The suffering itself was the message they wanted to send. Every element of her execution, from the initial stripping to the camel parade to the final horse dragging, was carefully designed to ensure that her death would be remembered and recounted for centuries. That women who might be tempted to accumulate political power would remember exactly what happened to women who overreached their proper place. That the lesson would be carved into historical memories so deeply that it could never be forgotten or ignored. And their plan worked exactly as intended. For over 1,000 years, Brunhilde was remembered primarily as a cautionary tale, a warning from history. The wicked queen who got exactly what she deserved. The woman who murdered kings and destroyed kingdoms and was righteously punished by a just ruler restoring order. It's only in recent decades that historians have finally begun to seriously question this narrative, to look past the obvious propaganda that Clother's chroniclers created to justify his actions, and try to see the real woman behind the manufactured legend. What they have discovered is infinitely more complicated than the simple story of good versus evil. Brunhilde was not a saint, that much is certain. She lived in an extraordinarily violent time, and undoubtedly did violent things to survive and maintain power. But she was also absolutely not the monster that her enemies spent decades portraying. She was a remarkably capable ruler in an era when capable rulers were desperately rare. She tried to maintain the remnants of Roman civilization when that civilization was collapsing all around her into barbarism. And for that accomplishment, for daring to be effective, she was destroyed in the most brutal and public way that her enemies could possibly devise. I've been thinking about Brunhilde for a long time now, turning her story over in my mind, thinking about what her story means for us today, what it reveals about human nature, why it still matters after 14 centuries. And here's what I keep coming back to, the truth that haunts me. What was done to Brunhilde was never about justice or righteousness. It was entirely about power and the fear of losing it. It was about a group of threatened men who were terrified of a woman who had proven herself their equal or better in every way that mattered, and who needed to destroy her so completely, so horrifically, that no woman would ever dare to do what she had done again. The charges against her, those dramatic accusations of murdering 10 kings that justified her execution, were obviously exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated from whole cloth. Clothard desperately needed to justify what he was planning to do, and he couldn't simply announce he was executing her because she was powerful and he wanted her gone. That would make him look like a tyrant, a murderer, a man afraid of a 70-year-old woman. So he created a carefully constructed narrative where she was a monster who had terrorized kingdoms, where her death was not political murder but divine justice, where he was not a conqueror executing a dangerous rival, but a righteous king punishing pure evil. This is what unchecked power does throughout history. It creates narratives to justify its exercise, and those narratives become accepted history if no one with authority challenges them. But here's the thing that haunts me most about this entire story, the detail I can't stop thinking about. The people who gathered to watch Brunhilde's execution, who laughed at her naked body being paraded, who cheered as she was dragged to her death, they didn't see themselves as participants in a monstrous injustice. They genuinely thought they were watching a villain get what she deserved. They had been told repeatedly by authorities they trusted that this woman was evil incarnate, that she had committed terrible crimes against their people, that her death was a good and necessary thing for the kingdom's future. This is how atrocities happen across all of human history. Not because people are naturally cruel, although some certainly are, but because ordinary people can be convinced that cruelty is justice. They can be told a compelling story that transforms a victim into a villain deserving punishment, and they will participate in absolute horror while genuinely believing they're doing good, that they're on the right side. The crowd that watched Brunhilde die thought they were witnessing righteous justice being served. They thought they were on the right side of history. They were catastrophically wrong. There's something else I need to tell you about Brunhilde's execution, another layer to this horror. Something that the medieval sources mention explicitly, but that modern accounts often leave out because it's too disturbing, too uncomfortable to discuss. The humiliation inflicted on Brunhilde was not just about destroying her body or her political legacy. It was about attacking her womanhood specifically, about punishing her for being a woman who dared to rule. Comment below what city you're watching from, and let me know your thoughts on this dark chapter of history. Make sure to like this video and share it with anyone fascinated by the untold stories that shaped our world, because Brunhilde's tale deserves to be remembered truthfully, not as propaganda written by her executioners. The specific things that were done to her, the deliberate stripping, the forced exposure, the humiliating parade, these were not random cruelties chosen on a whim. They were gendered cruelties, carefully selected torments. They were designed specifically to humiliate a woman in ways that a man would never have been humiliated, in ways that targeted her specifically because she was female. When male rulers were executed throughout history, they were typically killed quickly and efficiently, beheaded with a sword, stabbed in battle, strangled in their chambers. There might be public display of the body afterward as a warning, but the execution itself was usually swift and efficient. Male rulers were killed to remove them permanently from power. Their deaths were purely political acts, transactions of power. What was done to Brunhilde was fundamentally different in every way. The 3 days of systematic public degradation, the exposure of her naked 70-year-old body, the camel ride that was specifically designed to make her look ridiculous and foreign, these were not just about killing her and removing her from power. They were about punishing her for being a woman who had dared to accumulate and wield male power. The message being broadcast to every witness was brutally clear. Women who rule like men, who exercise authority like kings, will be humiliated like women. The things that could only be done to women, the forced exposure of the body, the sexual degradation, the reduction to mere flesh to be looked at and mocked by crowds, these were the specific punishments reserved for women who forgot their assigned place in the social order. I think about the women who watched this spectacle because there were definitely women in those massive crowds. Women who witnessed everything that happened to Brunhilde and understood exactly what it meant for their own lives. Women who learned the lesson that Clothar specifically intended them to learn and carry forward. For generations afterward, women throughout Frankish territories would remember what happened to Queen who ruled too long and too effectively, and they would remember what the ultimate cost of power was for a woman in their world. And many of them would decide that the cost was simply too high to risk. This is what Clothar really accomplished with those 3 days. Not just the death of one 70-year-old woman, but the suppression of countless women who might have been capable of ruling, who might have achieved greatness, but who looked at what happened to Brunhilde and decided to stay safely in their prescribed roles. The most successful acts of oppression throughout history are the ones that don't need to be repeated generation after generation. You make one example so horrifying, so brutally public, so utterly unforgettable that people police themselves afterward. They don't need to be directly threatened because they've already seen what happens to those who step out of line. Brunhilde's execution was precisely that kind of example. It echoed forward through centuries like a warning bell, teaching women across Europe what would happen if they overreached, and the lesson was learned so effectively that it didn't need to be taught again for a very long time. Let me tell you about the aftermath, about what happened the years after the horse finally stopped running and the fire finished burning. Clothar II became the sole ruler of all the Frankish kingdoms, the first unified king in decades. For the first time since anyone could remember, there was no rival king claiming territory, no regent queen wielding power, no divided inheritance tearing kingdoms apart. He had achieved what his mother Fredegund had spent her entire violent life trying to accomplish. Total, complete victory over the entire family of Brunhilde. He was celebrated throughout his realm as a great unifier, hailed as a man who had brought peace to the Frankish lands after decades of civil war, the man who had ended the bloodshed and brought stability. And he was extremely careful to ensure that his version of history, his narrative, was the only one that survived for future generations. His chroniclers wrote detailed accounts of Brunhilde that portrayed her as an inhuman monster. They attributed every death, every misfortune, every military setback of the previous 50 years to her dark machinations. They made her into a witch who practiced forbidden arts, a poisoner who eliminated rivals with toxins, a murderer who had personally killed 10 kings through her schemes. These accounts became the official history, the accepted truth. They were copied and recopied by monks in monasteries across Europe. When later historians sat down to write about this turbulent period, they drew exclusively on these accounts as their primary sources. And so the lie was perpetuated across centuries, becoming accepted fact. But there were cracks in this carefully constructed narrative, evidence that didn't quite fit. There were other sources scattered across archives, administrative records documenting daily governance, building inscriptions crediting her patronage, diplomatic letters that told a fundamentally different story. These sources showed a Brunhilde who built roads and bridges across her territories, who maintained a crumbling Roman infrastructure when others let it decay, who patronized churches and monasteries generously, who corresponded directly with the Pope about complex matters of theology and governance. These sources showed a Brunhilde who was capable, intelligent, and remarkably effective as a ruler, a woman who did what rulers do, sometimes ruthlessly when necessary, but no more ruthlessly than the male rulers who were praised and celebrated for identical actions. It took over 1,000 years for historians to finally begin piecing together this other Brunhilde, the real woman behind the propaganda. The Brunhilde who was not a monster spawned from hell, but a remarkably capable woman, doing her absolute best in impossible circumstances. The Brunhilde who was destroyed not because she was evil, but because she was effective, because she proved something dangerous. And when you see that Brunhilde clearly, when you understand who she really was, those 3 days of torture look very different. They look like exactly what they were: the punishment of competence, the destruction of a woman who had proven that women could rule as effectively as men, the message sent to every woman who might come after her, that the same horrific fate awaited anyone who dared to do what Brunhilde had done. I want to talk about Fredegund for a moment because her fate is deeply instructive when compared to Brunhilde's ending. Fredegund, by any objective historical measure, was significantly more ruthless than Brunhilde ever was. She personally ordered assassinations of rivals. She poisoned enemies without hesitation. She arranged the murder of her own stepchildren when they became inconvenient obstacles to her son's inheritance. The chronicles, even the ones written by people generally sympathetic to her cause, describe her as frighteningly violent and utterly immoral in her methods. And yet, how did Fredegund die? She died peacefully in her bed, of natural causes, at a reasonably old age for that brutal era. She was never publicly humiliated before jeering crowds. She was never stripped naked and paraded like an animal. She was never tied to a wild horse and dragged to death. She died as a queen with her power completely intact and was buried with full honors befitting her station. Why the dramatic difference? Because Fredegund understood something fundamental that Brunhilde perhaps did not fully grasp, or perhaps refused to accept. She understood that a woman could be as violent and ruthless as she wanted, could order as many deaths as necessary, as long as she exercised that violence in direct service to male power. Fredegund killed people, many people without hesitation or remorse, but she always killed them to advance her husband's interests first and then her son's interests after. She was content to be the power behind the throne rather than the power sitting openly on it. She played the game according to the rules. Brunhilde was fundamentally different. Brunhilde ruled openly and directly. She didn't pretend to be acting for her husband or her son or her grandsons. She ruled as herself, in her own name, by her own authority. She made decisions that shaped kingdoms. She issued orders that moved armies. She was a king in all but name, and everyone knew it. And for that transgression, for that refusal to hide, she had to be destroyed, not just killed quickly and forgotten, but humiliated in the most degrading ways imaginable, made into an example, shown to the entire world as what happens to women who refuse to hide behind men, who dare to rule in their own right. Fredegund understood the unwritten rules and played skillfully within them. She was rewarded with a peaceful death and an honored burial. Brunhilde broke the rules. She stepped out from behind the curtain, and she was punished with 3 days of systematic torture, followed by one of the most horrific executions ever recorded in medieval history. The lesson is not subtle or hidden. You can be a woman with real power, but only if you carefully pretend that the power truly belongs to a man. You can shape kingdoms and make history, but only if you do it through fathers and husbands and sons. Step out from behind the curtain, rule openly in your own name, and this is what happens. I think constantly about all the women throughout history who learned this lesson, who had the ability to lead but chose not to, who could have been Brunhildes but decided the risk was simply too great. How many potential leaders, potential builders, potential rulers chose to stay invisible because they knew exactly what visibility cost. We will never know the true number. That's the insidious thing about systematic oppression. We can count the people it killed and destroyed. We cannot count the people it silenced before they ever had a chance to speak, the talents that were suppressed, the potential that was never realized. There's something I haven't told you yet. Another layer to this tragedy that makes Brunhilde's story even more heartbreaking. She had family at the end. She wasn't alone in the world, isolated and forgotten. She had great-grandchildren, descendants of the children she had raised and then buried over her long life. When Clothar captured Brunhilde in 613, he didn't just capture her alone. He captured her entire remaining family. Her great-grandchildren, some of them children, some of them mere infants, were all in his complete power, and he killed them systematically. Not all at once in a single massacre. The sources suggest that some were killed immediately, executed within days of the capture. Others were allowed to live for a time, perhaps held as hostages for political leverage, perhaps used as bargaining chips in negotiations. But within just a few years of Brunhilde's execution, every single male descendant who might have had any legitimate claim to any of her kingdoms was dead. Clothar was brutally thorough in his purge. He had learned from history that survivors always seek revenge. His own existence was living proof of that truth. He was the son of Fredegund, carrying forward his mother's burning hatred into the next generation, continuing a war that should have died with her. He would not make the mistake of leaving anyone alive who might do the same to him or his heirs. So the line of Brunhilde ended completely, not just Brunhilde herself, but everyone connected to her by blood, everyone who might have preserved her memory differently, everyone who might have challenged a narrative that Clothar's chroniclers were busy creating. This is what total victory looks like in practice, not just defeating your enemy on the battlefield, but erasing them from existence, killing not just a leader, but the entire family, destroying not just a person, but the possibility of any alternative story ever being told. I think about those children, the great-grandchildren who were far too young to understand what was happening around them, who died because of a blood feud that had started decades before they were born, who never had a chance to grow up and become anything, because the crushing weight of history destroyed them before they could begin their lives. Brunhilde's execution was designed as a public spectacle, a theatrical warning. The children's deaths were quieter, less dramatic, but they were part of the same systematic project. The complete annihilation of everything Brunhilde had been, everything she represented, everyone connected to her. I've been asking myself why I want to tell you this story, why it matters today, what you should take from it. And I think the answer is this. Brunhilde's story is not ancient history, not something that happened so long ago and so far away that it has no relevance to our lives today. The dynamics that destroyed Brunhilde, the deep fear of powerful women, the narratives constructed to justify atrocity, the examples made to keep people in their assigned places, these dynamics are still with us. We still live in a world where women who accumulate power are treated fundamentally differently than men who accumulate the same power, where the same actions that make men decisive and strong make women difficult and aggressive, where women in authority face levels of criticism and scrutiny that men in the same positions simply do not face. We still live in a world where narratives are constructed to justify punishment and delegitimize those who threaten established power, where people are turned into monsters in stories before they're destroyed in reality, where the crowd is taught to hate before it's asked to participate in atrocity. We still live in a world where examples are made, where people are destroyed publicly and spectacularly to send messages to everyone who might think of following in their footsteps, where oppression works not just through direct violence, but through the fear of violence, through the memory of what happened to the last person who stepped out of line. Brunhilde died over 1,400 years ago in that field outside Renève, but the forces that killed her are not dead. They haven't disappeared into the past. They've taken different forms, expressed themselves through different means, targeted different people at different times, but they are still here with us. And I think we owe it to Brunhilde and to the countless other people who have been made examples of throughout history to recognize those forces when we see them operating, to question the narratives that justify atrocity, to refuse to be the crowd that laughs at suffering while telling ourselves the victim deserves it. The people who watched Brunhilde die thought they were on the right side of history. They had been told a story by authorities they trusted, and they believed it completely. They participated in horror because they genuinely thought they were participating in justice being served. We have the benefit of distance, of 14 centuries of perspective. We can see clearly that the story they were told was a lie. We can see that what was done to Brunhilde was not justice, but murder dressed up in the clothes of justice. Atrocity disguised as righteousness. But we don't always have the benefit of distance. Sometimes the stories are being told about people in our own time, right now. Sometimes we are being asked to participate in horror while being assured that it's justified and necessary. Sometimes we're the crowd watching. What do we do then? I think we ask ourselves honestly whether we would have laughed at Brunhilde, whether we would have believed the stories about her crimes, whether we would have participated in her humiliation and death. And if the answer makes us uncomfortable, if we suspect we might have been part of that crowd, maybe that discomfort can motivate us to be more careful going forward, to question the narratives we're told more critically, to refuse to participate in making examples of people until we are sure, absolutely certain, that we're not being manipulated into cruelty. Because 1,400 years from now, someone might be telling our story. And I would like to think that when they do, we will not be remembered as a crowd that laughed while an old woman was dragged to her death. I want to tell you one more thing about Brunhilde. One final detail that the sources preserve, though they may not have understood its true significance. When she was brought before Clothar for final time before the torture began, before those 3 days started, he demanded that she confess to murdering the 10 kings, confess to all the crimes and conspiracies that supposedly justified what he was about to do, give him the narrative he desperately needed to make her execution look like justice before the assembled crowd. She refused completely. An old woman of 70 facing the most powerful man in all of Western Europe, knowing with absolute certainty that she was about to die, knowing that nothing she said would change her fate or save her, she refused to give him confession he wanted. The sources present this refusal as stubbornness, as evidence of her wickedness. Look, she would not even admit her crimes. But I see it very differently. I see a woman who understood that the confession was not really about her or her fate. It was about history. Clothar wanted her words on the record, her own admission that she deserved what was about to happen. He wanted to be able to point to her confession for the rest of his life, and for all the years after his death and say, "See, she admitted it. She was guilty of everything. What I did was right and necessary." She would not give him that validation. She could not stop him from killing her. She could not stop him from torturing her, from humiliating her before thousands, from destroying her family and erasing her legacy. But she could refuse to participate in her own condemnation. She could refuse to speak the words that would make his narrative complete and unassailable. It was a small act of resistance, the only act of resistance still available to her in that moment, and she took it without hesitation. I think about that constantly, about the courage it must have taken to refuse him, about the knowledge that her refusal would probably make her suffering worse, because Clothar would be furious at being denied, because torture is often used specifically to extract confessions, and he would have every reason to escalate the pain. She refused anyway, knowing the cost. And because she refused, there's a crack in the narrative, a place where the official story doesn't quite fit together perfectly. If she was so obviously guilty, why did she not confess when death was certain? If the crimes were so clear and the evidence so overwhelming, why did she deny them to the very end? That small crack has allowed historians centuries later to begin questioning the whole story, to wonder if perhaps the narrative was not as solid as it seemed, to investigate deeper and discover the other Brunhilde, the builder, the administrator, the capable ruler who was destroyed not for her crimes, but for her capabilities, not for what she did wrong, but for what she did too well. This is what I'll leave you with today. The story of Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, a woman who ruled kingdoms for nearly 50 years, who survived wars and plagues and assassinations, who built roads and maintained civilization while chaos threatened. A woman who was ultimately destroyed not because she was evil, but because she was effective, not because she was a monster, but because she refused to hide her power behind men. Her execution was designed to be a warning that would echo through centuries, teaching women to know their place. But her refusal to confess, her final act of defiance, created a crack in that warning, a space for us to question, to investigate, to discover the truth beneath the lies. Make sure to hit that like button, share this video with anyone who needs to hear this story, and drop a comment below telling me what you think about Brunhilde's legacy. From sinister empires, this has been the story of a queen that history tried to erase. Remember her name, remember what happened to her, and question the narratives you're told about powerful women, both in history and today. Brunhilde's refusal to confess may have been the most important thing she did in those final days, more important than any words she could have spoken in her defense, because her silence left room for doubt, and doubt, given enough time and attention, can unravel even the most carefully constructed lies. I'm coming to the end of what I want to tell you about this remarkable woman, but there's one more thing you need to know. After the fire finished burning, after Clother's men had made absolutely sure that nothing recognizable remained of Brunhilde's body, after crowds had dispersed and the spectacle was finally over, life simply went on. Clothar ruled for another 15 years as a unified king. He was generally considered a successful ruler by the standards of his time. He maintained order across the territories. He kept the peace between rival factions. He did the things that kings are supposed to do, and then he died, as all kings do, and his kingdom was immediately divided among his sons. And the cycle of civil wars and dispute successions resumed exactly as it had before Brunhilde, exactly as it would continue for centuries after her death. Everything that Clothar claimed to be ending by destroying Brunhilde, the instability, the violence, the competing claims of power, absolutely none of it actually ended. The problems were structural, built into the system itself. They had nothing to do with one woman, no matter how capable or powerful she was. Killing Brunhilde didn't fix anything politically or militarily, but it did send a message, and that message lasted far longer than Clothar's kingdom. For generations afterward, women in Frankish territories were extremely careful not to accumulate too much visible power. They worked through husbands and sons, behind curtains and closed doors, never stepping into the light. They remembered what happened to a woman who had ruled openly and refused to hide. So, in a very real sense, Clothar won, not the political victory he publicly claimed, the unification of the kingdoms, the end of civil strife. That was temporary and crumbled within a generation. What lasted was the other victory, the one that mattered more. The suppression of women who might have been leaders, the enforcement of an unwritten rule that said women could have power only if they carefully pretended they did not. That victory lasted for a very long time, long after Clothar himself was forgotten by most people, long after the kingdoms he ruled had fragmented and reformed and been conquered a dozen times over. The lesson of Brunhilde endured in women's memories. It endured until people started questioning it, until historians began to look past the official narratives and see the woman behind the manufactured monster, until the story started to be told differently, more honestly. And now you know the story. You know what was done to Brunhilde and why. You know that the narrative of her wickedness was constructed specifically to justify her destruction. You know that she was a capable ruler who was punished for ruling while female, for refusing to hide her competence behind men. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But I hope you will remember her not as a monster of the medieval chronicles, not as a wicked queen who got what she deserved, but as a woman who built things and tried to maintain civilization, and was destroyed in the most brutal way possible because she was too good a job that was not supposed to be hers. Remember her standing in that field, 70 years old, stripped naked, facing the crowd that had come to watch her die. Remember that she did not confess to the crimes they wanted her to admit. Remember that she stood there with whatever dignity she could manage, while the world laughed at her exposed body. Remember that she was not a monster. She was a woman, And what happened to her was monstrous. That is the truth that Clodhar tried to bury with her broken body. That is the truth that his chroniclers try to hide behind manufactured accusations. That is the truth that you now know. Do not let it be forgotten again. If you've stayed with me this long through this dark journey, I want to thank you from Sinister Empires. This was not an easy story to tell, and I imagine it was not an easy story to hear, but I think it was an important one, because Brunhilde deserves to be remembered accurately after 1,400 years of being remembered falsely, because the dynamics that destroyed her are not safely buried in the past, because we all need to be reminded sometimes that the crowd is not always right, that official narratives are not always true, that examples are made of people specifically to keep the rest of us in line. I don't know if anything I've said will change how you see the world. I hope it will. I hope that the next time you hear a story about someone being punished, someone being made an example of, someone being destroyed publicly and spectacularly, you will pause. You will ask yourself whether you're hearing the truth or a narrative carefully constructed to justify what was done. You will wonder if you're being invited to join a crowd and what that crowd is really participating in. Brunhilde could not save herself. By the time she was captured and betrayed by her own nobles, her fate was sealed. Nothing she could have done would have changed what was about to happen in that field. But we can save her memory. We can tell her story accurately. Even after 1,400 years of lies and propaganda, we can refuse to let the narrative that Clodhar created be the final word on her life. And maybe by remembering Brunhilde truly, by seeing her clearly, we can make it a little bit harder for the next Clodhar to create the next false narrative. A little bit harder for the next crowd to participate in the next atrocity, while believing they are witnessing justice. That is what I hope anyway. Make sure to like this video, share it with anyone who needs to hear this untold story, and comment below with your thoughts on Queen Brunhilde's legacy and what it means for us today. From Sinister Empires, remember her name, question the narratives, and never forget that history is written by those who survived to tell it. But we have the power to rewrite it with truth. That is why I told you this story today. Thank you for listening and staying with me through this dark but necessary journey. Remember Brunhilde. Remember what was done to her in that field. Remember why they destroyed her so brutally. If this story meant something to you, if you think this history deserves to be told and share with others who need to hear it, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to Sinister Empires. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. More histories that have been deliberately buried under official narratives. More truths that deserve to be remembered and brought back into the light after centuries of darkness. And if you have thoughts about what I've shared today, questions that are burning in your mind, reactions to Brunhilde's story, things you want me to know or explore further, leave them in the comments below. I read every single one. They matter to me deeply, and sometimes they shape what I choose to talk about next, what stories need to be uncovered. The story of Brunhilde is over, but the conversation about what it means doesn't have to be. Thank you for being here with me today. From Sinister Empires, keep questioning, keep remembering, and never let them erase the truth.